Everyone's seen a World War II tank, but almost no one has actually looked at one closely enough to ask the right questions. You've seen the photos. Sherman tanks rolling through snow-covered forests, half-tracks parked along frozen roads, tank destroyers sitting in fields blanketed by white. And if you look carefully at those photos, something stands out, something that once you notice it, you can't unsee. The barrel is white, freshly painted, bright white, sometimes chalky, sometimes almost glowing against the gray winter sky. But the hull? The hull is still olive drab. Still that dark, muddy green-brown that American armor wore from Tunisia to the Rhine. The barrel is white, the hull is not. And that contrast, that strange, deliberate, almost baffling decision, is the starting point for one of the most fascinating untold stories of the entire Western Front. Because it wasn't random, it wasn't laziness, it wasn't even a mistake, it was a calculated answer to a problem that nobody at higher command had fully prepared for. A problem that showed up in the Ardennes in December 1944 and nearly broke the American armored force in ways that bullets and shells hadn't managed to do. If you've ever wondered why American tankers did this, if you've ever looked at those winter photographs and thought, that doesn't make any sense, then stay right here. Because what you're about to hear isn't the cleaned-up version. It's the actual story of what happened when American armor met a European winter it wasn't ready for, and how the crews on the ground figured out solutions that nobody at the top had thought to give them. And if this kind of granular, ground-level history is what you're after, the kind that gets into the decisions behind the decisions, then hit subscribe right now, because this is exactly what we do here, every single time. Let's go back to the beginning, not to 1944. Earlier than that. Because to understand why the barrel was white and the hull wasn't, you have to understand how American armor thought about camouflage in the first place, which is to say, not very much. The United States Army entered the Second World War with a doctrine that was, in many ways, borrowed and improvised. The tank had been a British and French invention, refined through the bloody experiments of the First World War, and the interwar years had produced competing theories about how armor should be used. The Germans had developed blitzkrieg, concentrated armored thrusts that bypassed strongpoints and drove deep into enemy rear areas. The Soviets had developed their own deep battle theory along similar lines. The Americans had watched all of this with interest, but had come to their own conclusions, which emphasized tank destroyers for anti-tank work and medium tanks for infantry support and exploitation. Camouflage was part of doctrine, but it was low on the priority list. The standard color for American ground vehicles from 1943 onward was olive drab, Federal Standard 595 color number 24087 if you want to get precise about it. A dark, desaturated brownish green that was meant to blend reasonably well in temperate European or Mediterranean environments. Against fields, hedgerows, mud, forest undergrowth, rubble, and the general visual chaos of a combat zone, olive drab did a reasonable job. It wasn't perfect, but it was adequate. And adequacy was the operating standard. American logistics were stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, across improvised supply chains, across ports that had been damaged by bombing and harbor clearance operations. Getting ammunition, fuel, spare parts, food, and medicine to the front was hard enough. Specialized camouflage paint was not the first thing anyone was thinking about. There was also a cultural dimension to this. American doctrine, American military culture, and to a large extent, American public perception of the war, all leaned toward aggression and momentum. You moved fast, you hit hard, you didn't hide. The idea of carefully camouflaging every vehicle implied a kind of defensiveness, a kind of waiting, that didn't fit with the image of American armor punching through the Wehrmacht. Speed was camouflage, tempo was camouflage. If you were moving fast enough, the enemy didn't have time to spot you before you were already somewhere else. That attitude worked pretty well from Normandy through the summer and fall of 1944. The breakout from the Bocage, the race across France, the liberation of Paris, the dash toward the German border. American armor was moving so fast that concealment was almost irrelevant. You didn't need to hide a tank that was somewhere else by the time the enemy got a fix on it. But then things slowed down. The supply lines stretched to breaking point. The German border fortifications, the Siegfried Line, proved more resilient than anyone had hoped. And by November 1944, the Western Front had settled into something that looked uncomfortably like a stalemate. Positions were dug in, movement was measured in hundreds of yards rather than dozens of miles, and winter was coming. The winter of 1944 and 1945 would turn out to be one of the coldest on record in Western Europe. Temperatures dropped well below freezing across Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Snow came early and stayed late. Forests that had been green in September were stripped bare by November and buried under white by December. And the landscape that olive drab had been reasonably suited for was completely transformed. Think about what that means for a tank sitting in an olive drab paint scheme. In summer, against fields, hedgerows, and mixed terrain, it blends reasonably well. In winter, against a field of white snow, it stands out like a bruise on pale skin. From the air, from an observation post, from a scout looking through binoculars, an olive drab Sherman in a winter landscape is one of the easiest things in the world to spot. The contrast is total. You have a dark, irregular shape against a bright, continuous background. Every tanker who spent any time in a winter position knew this. The problem was visible to anyone who opened their eyes. But knowing the problem and solving it are two different things. And the solution requires resources, time, and organization, all of which were in short supply by the time the winter really hit. The German offensive that launched on December 16, 1944, what Americans call the Battle of the Bulge, changed the calculation completely. Suddenly, American armor wasn't just dealing with cold and poor visibility. It was dealing with a full-scale German armored attack that had torn through the Ardennes and was threatening to split the Allied armies in two. The Ardennes in December was a particular kind of military nightmare. Dense forest, narrow roads, minimal infrastructure, extreme cold, fog so thick that air support was grounded for days at a stretch, and snow, deep, covering, relentless snow that turned every field into a white sheet and every tree line into a pale ghost of itself. In that environment, camouflage became a survival issue rather than a doctrinal preference. A tank that could be spotted at 500 meters against a white background was a tank that was going to get hit. A tank that could break up its silhouette, even imperfectly, was a tank that might survive long enough to fight. And the tankers who were actually in the Ardennes, actually sitting in their vehicles at 2 in the morning with the temperature at -15 and German armor somewhere in the tree line, those men understood this with a clarity that no training document had prepared them for. So they improvised. Because American soldiers, whatever their other limitations, were extraordinarily good at improvising. The most immediate solution was whitewash, not house paint, not specialized military camouflage paint, whitewash, the kind used on farm buildings and outhouses. Calcium hydroxide dissolved in water, cheap, available, and white. It could be applied with brushes, with mops, with rags, with bare hands if necessary. It dried quickly in cold temperatures, and when applied to metal, it gave a flat, chalky white coating that dramatically reduced the visual contrast of a dark vehicle against a white background. Units that could get their hands on whitewash applied it. Units that couldn't find whitewash tried other things. Flour and water mixed into a crude paste, chalk dust suspended in liquid. In some cases, crews simply draped white sheets over whatever they could cover. Bed sheets pulled from abandoned Belgian farmhouses, parachute silk from supply drops, linen tablecloths, anything white that could be attached to the outside of a vehicle and held in place. But here's where it gets interesting, because even the units that applied whitewash didn't apply it everywhere. And the pattern of application, the specific choices about what got painted white and what didn't, tells you a great deal about what those crews were actually trying to accomplish and what constraints they were working within. The barrel got painted white almost universally. When you look at photographs of American armor from the Ardennes and the subsequent winter campaigns into Germany, the gun tube, the long cylinder of the main armament, projecting forward from the turret, is almost always white. Sometimes it's crisply done, almost professional looking. Sometimes it's sloppy, clearly applied in a hurry with whatever was at hand. But it's white. Consistently, across units, across time, across the theater. The hull, by contrast, is often not white. Or it's partially white, or it's white on top but not on the sides. Or it was white at some point but has worn down to a patchy, mottled mix of white and olive drab. The hull treatment is inconsistent. The barrel treatment is not. Why? Why the barrel specifically? Why almost universally, across units that had no unified direction to do this, did American tankers choose to paint their barrels white? The first answer is the most obvious, and it's the one that gets cited most often in the secondary literature. The barrel is the most visually distinctive part of a tank. It's long, it's thin, and it protrudes far forward of the vehicle, creating a clear horizontal line that the human eye registers instantly against almost any background. In winter terrain, against snow and bare trees, that dark horizontal line is what gives away a tank's position. Paint the barrel white and you eliminate the most conspicuous single feature. You don't perfectly camouflage the tank, but you break up the most obvious visual signature. But that answer, while true, doesn't fully explain the pattern. Because if visual concealment were the only goal, you'd paint the hull too. The hull is much larger than the barrel. It presents a much bigger visual target. A dark hull against white snow is more visible than a dark barrel against white snow. So why did the hull so often stay unpainted or only partially painted? This is where the operational reality of maintaining armor in combat conditions comes into the picture, and it's the part of the story that almost nobody talks about. Painting a barrel is easy. The gun tube is a smooth, accessible surface. It's at a convenient height. It doesn't have hinges, hatches, tools, or equipment attached to it. You can apply whitewash to a barrel in 5 minutes with a brush or a rag. One person can do it alone. It doesn't require moving anything or working around any other piece of equipment. Painting a hull is a completely different proposition. The hull of an M4 Sherman is roughly 20 feet long and nearly 9 feet wide. Its surface is irregular, broken up by hatches, periscopes, headlights, tools, spare track sections, tow cables, and all the equipment that crews lash to the outside of their vehicles because the interior never had enough storage. Properly coating a hull takes time, takes materials, and requires multiple people working in coordination. And time was exactly what nobody had in December 1944. When the German offensive hit, American units were scrambling to plug gaps, reinforce positions, move to new locations, and respond to a rapidly changing tactical situation. Spending an hour or two coating an entire hull in whitewash was a luxury that most units simply couldn't afford. But 5 minutes on the barrel? That was achievable even in the middle of a crisis. There's also the question of material availability. Whitewash wasn't standardized military supply. It wasn't in the quartermaster catalog as an item to be requisitioned and distributed. Units had to find it locally, which meant taking it from Belgian and Luxembourg farmhouses, from abandoned hardware stores, from wherever a resourceful sergeant could lay his hands on it. The amount available at any given time was limited, and when you have limited material, you prioritize. You paint the thing that gives you the most benefit for the least material. You paint the barrel. But there's a third factor, and this one is perhaps the most revealing. The barrel needed to stay white because it was the thing most likely to give your position away to specific threats. Not general observation, but the particular threat of an enemy gunner or an anti-tank team looking for a target. When a German anti-tank gunner, a Pak-40 crew, or a Jagdpanzer crew was scanning for American tanks, what they were looking for was the profile of an armored vehicle. In a winter landscape, that profile was defined by certain key features: the turret shape, the track silhouette, and above all, the barrel. Because the barrel told you not just that a tank was there, but which way it was pointing, which way the threat was oriented, where the gun was aimed. An anti-tank gunner who could see an enemy barrel could calculate the angle, could determine whether the tank was facing him or facing away, could estimate range and lead. The barrel, in other words, was tactically informative in a way that the hull was not. If you could make that barrel disappear against the winter background, even briefly, even imperfectly, you bought yourself time. Time is the currency of survival in armored combat. The hull, by contrast, was less immediately tactically informative. Yes, it was visible. Yes, it presented a larger target, but it didn't tell an enemy gunner as much. A hull can be misidentified as a pile of equipment, as a building, as a piece of terrain. A long, dark barrel pointing at you is unmistakable. There was also the question of vehicle maintenance and accessibility. The hull of a Sherman was constantly being worked on. Crews and maintenance personnel accessed engine compartments, suspension components, and track assemblies on a near-daily basis. Painting those surfaces white meant that every time a mechanic crawled underneath to check a bogie wheel or a driver opened the hull access hatches to check the transmission, the white paint got scraped, smeared, or contaminated with grease and mud. The hull surface, in constant use and constant contact with mud, snow, and mechanical work, didn't hold whitewash well. The barrel, rarely touched and never crawled over, held it much better. And there's one more factor that almost never gets mentioned in the standard accounts: the psychological dimension. Painting a tank white, completely and uniformly, is a statement. It says, we are going to be here, in this terrain, for a while. We have assessed the situation and made a deliberate decision about concealment. It implies a certain kind of defensive posture, a waiting posture, that didn't always match the way American tankers and their officers thought about their role. Painting the barrel white was different. It was a quick, functional measure. It said, we've done what we can, we're still mobile, we're still aggressive, and we haven't lost our fighting edge just because it's cold and white outside. That might sound like an intangible, and in some ways it is. But unit morale and unit self-image matter in combat. The way a crew talks about its vehicle, the way it maintains it, the small decisions it makes about presentation and preparation, all of those things feed back into how the crew feels about itself and its capabilities. A barrel painted white in 5 minutes by a cold, tired crew in the middle of a German offensive was a statement of continued competence under difficult conditions. So the whitewashed barrel wasn't one decision. It was the intersection of a dozen different pressures: tactical, logistical, material, psychological, and operational, all pointing toward the same solution. Paint the barrel. Do what you can. Keep fighting. Now, having established why the barrel got painted, we need to dig into the why not of the hull a little further. Because the partial painting of American armor in winter 1944 and 1945 wasn't just a matter of laziness or material shortage. It reflected a genuine tension in American doctrine about what camouflage was for and who was responsible for it. American armor doctrine as it existed in 1944 was primarily derived from the North African and Italian campaigns. In North Africa, the landscape was sand and scrub. Camouflage was almost irrelevant at the visual range of tank engagements, and the primary concern was concealment from air observation. In Italy, the terrain was so confined and so vertical that concealment was achieved through positioning rather than painting. A tank hull down behind a ridge was concealed, regardless of its color. Neither of those environments prepared the doctrine writers for the specific challenge of winter camouflage in temperate Europe. The field manuals of 1944 had guidance on camouflage, but it was general and imprecise. Units were advised to use local materials and to match their surroundings, but there was no specific guidance on winter whitewashing, no standard procedure for applying or removing it, and no organizational structure for ensuring it got done uniformly across a formation. This is important because it meant that winter camouflage in 1944 and 1945 was entirely a unit-level decision. Individual commanders, individual crews, individual maintenance officers decided whether to do it, how to do it, and what to prioritize. There was no army-wide directive saying paint your barrels white. There was no official formula for whitewash distribution. It happened because the men closest to the problem figured out the solution on their own and applied it within whatever constraints they faced. Compare this to the German approach. The Wehrmacht had been dealing with Russian winters since 1941, and the lessons of that experience had been codified and distributed. German armor in winter often received official whitewash kits, and there were specific procedures for applying and removing seasonal camouflage. The paint used was typically water-soluble, designed to wash off easily when spring came, without damaging the underlying paint or markings. German vehicles in winter photos tend to show more uniform and more complete white coverage than their American counterparts. But the Germans had 3 years of bitter winter experience behind them by the time the Ardennes battle started. American armor was encountering its first major European winter campaign, essentially without that institutional memory. The British and Commonwealth forces, who had experience in North Africa and were operating in Northern Europe alongside the Americans, had a similarly ad hoc approach. British Cromwells and Churchills in winter photographs show the same pattern as American vehicles: partial whitewash, often concentrated on the most visible surfaces, applied with whatever was available locally. The Soviets, like the Germans, had developed more systematic winter camouflage procedures. Red Army armor from 1942 onward routinely received white paint or whitewash before winter campaigns, and there were established resupply channels for the materials. Soviet winter photos show a much higher percentage of completely white vehicles, though the quality of application was often rough and the coverage imperfect. But at least it was systematic. The Americans were, by winter 1944, reinventing a wheel that the Soviets and Germans had already designed and tested. The difference was that the Americans were doing it in the middle of a major battle, under fire, in extreme cold, with improvised materials. And here is where we need to talk about the specific tactical consequences of the imperfect white paint. Because those consequences were real, documented, and directly influenced how the Battle of the Bulge unfolded at the unit level. Several American after-action reports from December 1944 and January 1945 specifically mentioned the visibility problem created by dark vehicles in white terrain. Reconnaissance elements operating in the Ardennes reported that German vehicles wearing winter whitewash were significantly harder to spot than American vehicles in olive drab, particularly at ranges beyond 300 meters. Tank destroyers in defensive positions found that their camouflage was compromised the moment snow fell, and they hadn't had time to apply whitewash. Artillery forward observers noted that American armor was easier to locate from their own positions, which was not reassuring, because if a friendly observer could spot it easily, a German observer could too. There are specific incidents documented in regimental histories and division after-action reports where the visibility of dark American vehicles in white terrain contributed directly to vehicle losses. Tanks that had been in concealed positions were spotted when snow fell and changed the contrast ratio. Tank destroyers waiting in ambush were compromised because their olive drab hulls were visible before the German vehicles they were waiting for came into range. The 2nd Armored Division, the 3rd Armored Division, the 4th Armored Division, the 7th Armored Division, all of them generated internal reports during the Bulge campaign that addressed the camouflage problem in some way. The solutions varied by unit, by availability of materials, and by the tactical situation of the moment. But the problem was universally recognized. And this is where the barrel painting becomes particularly significant. Because in the absence of complete vehicle whitewashing, the decision to paint at least the barrel represented a triage of the visibility problem. You couldn't hide the whole vehicle. You could reduce its most distinctive visual signature, and so that's what crews did, even when they had no formal instructions to do it, even when they had no standardized materials to do it with. Let me describe what this actually looked like in practice, because the logistics of the thing are interesting. A Sherman tank crew in December 1944 in the Ardennes. It's somewhere around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew is living partly in the tank and partly in improvised shelters or abandoned farm buildings nearby. The vehicle has been in position for anywhere from hours to days. The snow is falling or has already fallen and created a white ground cover. One of the crew, typically the loader or the assistant driver, who has more time outside the vehicle than the commander or gunner, takes whatever whitening material is available and applies it to the barrel. If whitewash is available, it goes on with a brush, a cloth, or whatever comes to hand. If whitewash isn't available, a mix of flour and water or chalk dust and water, or whatever else the crew has improvised, gets slapped on. The application is quick, not precise. The goal is coverage, not artistry. The result is a barrel that varies from almost pristinely white to a chalky, streaky approximation of white with patches of olive drab showing through. But even a streaky, imperfect white is better than a uniform dark color in a white landscape. The hull might or might not get the same treatment, depending on time, material, and the tactical situation. If the unit has been in position for several days and there's enough whitewash available, the hull might get a partial coat, usually on the most exposed upper surfaces. The vertical side armor often gets left unpainted because it's less visible from the observer positions and covering positions that matter most. The horizontal surfaces, the engine deck, the turret top, the glacis plate, are more likely to get whitewash because they're more visible from elevated observation positions and from aircraft. But the barrel is almost always done first, and most completely, because the barrel is the thing that gives you away. Now, there's another dimension to this story that moves us beyond the Ardennes and into the broader winter campaign of early 1945. Because the Battle of the Bulge ended, the Germans were pushed back, and American armor crossed into Germany itself, and the winter continued. By February 1945, the supply situation had improved enough that some units were receiving official whitewash from quartermaster channels. The Army had finally recognized that winter camouflage was a supply requirement and had begun treating it as such. Some units were issued white paint specifically formulated for vehicle application. Others received bulk whitewash compound. A few units even received official guidance on application and removal. But by this point, the improvised methods were already established. Crews who had figured out their own solutions in December weren't waiting for official guidance in February. The barrel painting was by now a habit, a standard practice, something that happened automatically when winter terrain was encountered. New crew members learned it from veterans. It propagated through units not through orders but through example and experience. And the pattern of barrel painting versus hull painting persisted even when more materials were available. Because even with official whitewash in supply, the time and effort calculations still applied. The barrel was still faster, the barrel was still the priority, and by now, enough veterans had seen enough results to know empirically that painting the barrel made a difference in ways that were immediately visible and tactically relevant. There's also the question of what happened when winter ended. Because winter camouflage that works in February becomes a liability in April, white vehicles in green terrain are even more conspicuous than olive drab vehicles in white terrain. The whitewash had to come off. Whitewash, particularly the improvised farm-sourced variety, came off relatively easily. Rain, mud, and mechanical contact wore it away quickly. In some cases, crews actively washed their vehicles to remove the whitewash as spring approached. The water-soluble nature of whitewash, one of its disadvantages in terms of durability in wet winter conditions, became an advantage when it came time to remove it. But this also meant that whitewash applied in December might be gone by January through normal wear and weather, requiring reapplication if conditions remained snowy. The temporary nature of the material meant that winter camouflage was an ongoing maintenance task rather than a one-time job. And this further reinforced the priority given to the barrel, because if you're going to reapply whitewash repeatedly, you apply it where it matters most. You apply it to the barrel. There were, of course, exceptions to every aspect of this pattern. Some units achieved very thorough hull whitewashing, particularly when they had time to prepare defensive positions carefully before German advances reached them. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne, surrounded and under siege, had time to think about concealment in ways that mobile units didn't. Photos from Bastogne show American vehicles with more complete white coverage than many of their counterparts in more fluid sectors. Similarly, tank destroyer battalions operating in the ambush role had both stronger motivation and sometimes more time to achieve better camouflage. A tank destroyer sitting in a prepared ambush position, waiting for German armor to come to it, had strong incentive to be invisible. If you saw it first, it was dead before it ever fired. Surviving M10 and M36 tank destroyer photos from winter 1944 and 1945 sometimes show more complete whitewash coverage than Sherman photos, reflecting this difference in tactical role. But even among tank destroyers, the barrel is almost always the most carefully painted element, because the barrel is the barrel. It is the thing that reveals your nature, your orientation, and your intent. Cover everything else and leave the barrel dark, and you still have a dark barrel pointing at the world, announcing exactly what you are. Now, let's zoom out from the tactical level and think about what this episode reveals about how armies learn and adapt. Because the winter camouflage question of 1944 and 1945 is not just a narrow technical story. It's a case study in institutional learning under pressure, and it has implications that go well beyond tank paint. The United States Army in 1944 was a mass organization that had expanded from roughly 175,000 men in 1939 to over 8 million by the end of the war. That expansion was extraordinary, and it was accomplished by selecting and training millions of civilians in a very short time. The officer corps that led those men was similarly expanded, drawing on ROTC graduates, officer candidate school products, and enlisted men promoted from the ranks. This mass expansion created certain institutional characteristics. The Army was good at logistics, at production, at moving large quantities of men and materiel. It was less good at absorbing and distributing tactical lessons from one part of the front to another. Information existed, after-action reports were written, lessons were recorded, but the mechanisms for getting those lessons into the hands of frontline units quickly and consistently were imperfect. Winter camouflage was a perfect example of this gap. The lesson was obvious to anyone who spent 5 minutes in a snowfield looking at an olive drab Sherman, but the lesson had to travel from the Ardennes, through unit reports, through theater headquarters, through doctrine writers, through supply channels, before it became standardized policy. That process took months. The men in the field couldn't wait months, so they solved it themselves. This is the pattern that repeats throughout military history. Institutional solutions lag behind tactical realities. The gap is filled by improvisation. The improvised solutions either get absorbed into doctrine eventually, or they persist as informal practice that gets passed down informally through the force. Winter barrel painting was never formally codified in American doctrine. It never became a regulation or a standard operating procedure. It became what it became because enough tankers figured out independently that it was the right thing to do. And that fact, that thousands of individual soldiers reached essentially the same conclusion without formal coordination, tells you something important about the problem itself. When the same solution emerges independently from multiple different units facing the same challenge, it's because the problem is clear and the solution is obviously correct. The barrel was the problem. Whitewashing it was the solution. You didn't need a field manual to figure that out. There is also a broader story here about the relationship between doctrine and practice, between the official way things are supposed to be done and the actual way things get done under operational conditions. Military doctrine is written in conditions of peace, at desks, by officers who have time to think and write carefully. It is applied in conditions of war, in the field, by soldiers who have no time and imperfect information. The gap between those two environments is always large and sometimes enormous. The American approach to that gap, relying heavily on unit initiative and individual problem solving, had both strengths and weaknesses. The strength was adaptability. American units in World War II were generally very good at improvising solutions to unexpected problems. The weakness was inconsistency. Different units found different solutions to the same problem, some better than others, and there was no guarantee that the best solution would propagate quickly to the units that hadn't figured it out yet. The barrel painting solution spread because it was simple, visible, and obviously effective. A tanker seeing another unit's vehicles with white barrels in a snow-covered landscape would immediately understand why it had been done, and immediately apply the same logic to his own vehicle. No briefing required, no manual necessary. The visual evidence was self-explanatory. That kind of horizontal knowledge transfer, unit to unit, crew to crew, driven by direct observation rather than formal instruction, is one of the underappreciated mechanisms of military learning. It's fragile because it depends on proximity and opportunity, but when it works fast, and it spreads efficiently across a theater. Now let's talk about the specific equipment involved, because understanding the physical characteristics of American armor in this period helps explain both the camouflage challenge and the solutions that were adopted. The M4 Sherman was the workhorse of American armored forces in the European theater. By late 1944, several variants were in service. The most common were the M4A1, with its distinctive rounded cast hull, the M4A3 with a welded hull and the Ford GAA V8 engine, and the M4A3E8, the so-called Easy 8, with improved suspension and wider tracks. Most vehicles by this point mounted the 75mm or the 76mm main gun, with the 76mm becoming increasingly common as the need to engage heavier German armor became apparent. The main gun was the most obvious element of the vehicle's profile. The 75mm gun in its M3 mounting had a barrel length of roughly 37 calibers, meaning the barrel was about 228 inches, just under 19 feet, long including the breech. The 76mm gun in the M1 mounting was longer, at 55 calibers, giving a barrel length of roughly 165 inches for the tube alone outside the mantlet. These were long projections, extending well forward of the turret face, and they created exactly the kind of strong horizontal line that was maximally visible in a white landscape. From above, at moderate range, a Sherman hull might be mistaken for many things. It sits low, it's roughly rectangular, and at the distances involved in typical aerial or ground observation, it can blend with other rectangular shapes in the landscape. Haystacks, farm vehicles, knocked-out equipment, rubble piles, all of these can produce similar silhouettes under poor visibility conditions. But the barrel is distinctive. Nothing else in a winter landscape looks like a tank barrel pointing at you. Nothing produces that specific horizontal line extending from a turret-shaped protrusion. Eliminate that line, or at least reduce its contrast, and you've eliminated the most reliable identifier of the vehicle's nature. The turret itself was another matter. The rounded or faceted form of a Sherman turret was also distinctive, but it was shorter and presented a more variable profile depending on viewing angle. The barrel was always long, always horizontal, and always pointed in the direction the gun was aimed. It was the primary visual diagnostic feature of the vehicle. The M10 tank destroyer, based on the Sherman chassis but with an open-top turret and mounting the same 3-inch M7 gun, had an even longer and more distinctive barrel profile. The 3-inch gun at 50 calibers gave a barrel length of about 150 inches, and the open turret meant the gun could depress further than a Sherman's, sometimes pointing the barrel downward and making it even more prominent against a white background. M10 crews had at least as strong a motivation to whitewash their barrels as Sherman crews, and the photographic record suggests they generally did. The M36 Jackson, mounting the 90mm M3 gun, appeared in the European theater in fall 1944 and saw significant service during the Bulge and subsequent winter fighting. The 90mm gun at 50 calibers had a barrel nearly as long as the M10's, and the higher velocity round created more muzzle blast, which stripped whitewash faster. M36 crews, working with a weapon that was increasingly necessary against the Tiger and Panther tanks appearing in greater numbers, had particular reason to maintain their concealment, and barrel whitewashing was standard among units equipped with the vehicle. And then there's the M18 Hellcat, the fastest tank destroyer of the war, capable of over 60 miles per hour on good road. The M18 mounted the same 76mm gun as the late-model Sherman, in an open turret on a much lighter and lower-profile chassis. Its speed was its primary defense, but in defensive positions, concealment mattered as much as anywhere. M18 crews were, if anything, more diligent about whitewashing barrels, partly because their open turrets made them more vulnerable to anything that spotted them. All of these vehicles shared the same basic visual challenge in winter terrain, and all of them showed the same pattern of improvised barrel whitewashing in the photographic record. There is also the matter of German optics and German detection methods, which adds another dimension to why the barrel was the priority target for concealment. German anti-tank units in 1944 and 1945 were equipped with optics that were, by the standards of the time, excellent. German gun sights and observation equipment were generally of higher quality than Allied equivalents, with better magnification and light-gathering capacity. This meant that a German anti-tank crew could identify and engage American armor at longer ranges, under poorer light conditions, than American crews could reciprocate. The darkness advantage that German optics provided made the visibility of American vehicles at long range a more serious tactical problem than it might otherwise have been. Against good optics in clear winter air, an olive drab barrel at 500 meters was perfectly visible. A whitewashed barrel at the same range was significantly harder to detect, particularly if the surrounding snow cover created a continuous white background. The contrast reduction achieved by even imperfect whitewashing could mean the difference between being detected at maximum German optic range and not being detected until German vehicles had closed to a range where the engagement was more even. This is a subtle but important point. Whitewash didn't make you invisible. It didn't even make you hard to see at close range in good conditions. What it did was reduce the range at which an enemy with superior optics could first detect you. In a tactical environment where the enemy's optics advantage was significant, even a modest reduction in detection range could be meaningful. The same logic applied to German observation aircraft. The Fieseler Storch light observation plane was extensively used for artillery spotting and tactical reconnaissance throughout the war. From the air, in winter terrain, a dark vehicle against white ground was maximally visible. A whitewashed vehicle was not invisible from the air, but it was less distinct, less immediately identifiable, harder to locate precisely. Against artillery spotters using aerial observation, that reduction in visibility could make the difference between being registered as a target and being overlooked. All of these considerations pointed toward the same conclusion: whitewash the barrel. Do it first. Do it with whatever you have. Do the hull if you can, but do the barrel no matter what. And then do it again, when the rain, or the warmth, or the mud wears it away. Because in a winter campaign, nothing stays white by itself. Let me now address something that often comes up when this topic is discussed, which is the question of official policy. Was there ever an official American policy on winter camouflage in Europe? And if so, what did it actually say? The answer is complicated. There was no theater-wide directive issued in 1944 that specifically ordered units to whitewash their vehicles for winter. The initial German offensive in December caught the command structure focused on other priorities, and the improvised solutions developed in December happened without formal sanction. However, as January 1945 progressed and the immediate crisis of the Bulge was resolved, higher command did begin to address the camouflage question more formally. Army group-level directives in late January and February 1945 noted the importance of winter camouflage and authorized the use of whitewash. Supply channels began to include whitewash compound in their distribution. Some units received white paint formulated specifically for vehicle application. But these official measures largely ratified and formalized what units were already doing independently. They didn't change the pattern of application, which remained focused on barrels and upper surfaces rather than complete hull coverage. They didn't introduce new techniques. They confirmed and supported the improvised practices that had evolved from necessity. The after-action reports that survive from this period are instructive. Several division-level reports from February and March 1945 note that winter camouflage had been applied with varying levels of completeness, and they recommend improved supply of whitewash materials for future winter operations. None of them suggest that the barrel-first approach was wrong or inadequate. The tacit endorsement is clear. Units had figured out what needed to be done, and the official system's job was to support them in doing it. There is also documentation of training on winter camouflage being incorporated into replacement training during early 1945, as units that had learned hard lessons in the Ardennes shared their experience with incoming soldiers. The barrel painting practice was explicitly discussed in some of this informal training, passed on from veterans to replacements as the kind of knowledge that kept you alive. That kind of informal knowledge transmission, the hard-won lessons of one cohort of soldiers being passed to the next, is how armies accumulate real operational knowledge over time. The official doctrine catches up eventually, if it catches up at all. But the working knowledge of how to survive in specific conditions moves faster through units, because it moves person to person, crew to crew, through direct experience and direct teaching. The whitewashed barrel became part of that working knowledge. It was never in a field manual in 1944. It was never in a direct